In this section, you learn about deconstructing tuples, which let you unpackage all the items in a tuple in a single operation. So let me flip over to Visual Studio, where I'll create a simple console application to demonstrate how to deconstruct it. So here we are over in Visual Studio. I've created a simple console application to demonstrate deconstructing tuples. So let me run you through what we've got here. We have a function called getStock, and that returns a tuple with 3 elements. We also have a rectangle with 2 elements in it, and it can deconstruct the rectangle out into 2 separate variables. And the old way to deconstruct, in this case the rectangle, we can deconstruct it into our local w and h variables, is to individually call the properties on the rectangle. For tuples, however, there are 4 ways to deconstruct a tuple. And the first way is to actually explicitly declare the type of each field. So here I've said integer width, integer height equals r. Now r in this case is the rectangle. So I'm not assigning the rectangle to it. Under the skin, the C#7 compiler calls this deconstruct function, and it actually must be called deconstruct. If I press compile, you'll see build succeeded. But even if I change it to a lowercase d, I've now got a compiler error, and it says it does not contain the definition for deconstruct. So it must be called deconstruct exactly as written here. You can't call it deconstruction or any other name. So what that does is it calls this function and pulls out the width and the height. And I've stored the width and the height. In this case, I've actually explicitly declared the type of each field, which is an integer and an integer. Now, in this case, I've done the same thing, explicitly declared the type of each field. However, you don't have to call them width and height. I could have called them A and B. In this case, I've called them rect width and rect height, which is different to the width and height in the rectangle. I can call them anything I wish. And if I run this, you'll see that 1A and 1B both return 55 and 77. So let me show you another way to deconstruct a tuple. The next way is to use the var keyword. If you notice, I've got the var keyword outside the parenthesis, and I don't have to declare what type the width and the height is. And if I run this code, you can see number 2 printed 55 and 77 as before. The third way is to use the var keyword individually. So here I've got a var, and here I've also mixed it. I've got an integer here and a var over here. Although I wouldn't advise mixing them. I find it far easier if you just stick to one method. And if I run these, you'll see 3a and 3b both print the same values. And finally, you can deconstruct tuples into pre-existing variables. So here I've pre-created 2 variables here, and I've asked them to be deconstructed into those variables directly. And running this code, you can see number 4 prints the same values. So you can deconstruct, and it actually dynamically creates the variables here, or you can pre-create them up front and deconstruct later. And under the skin, it's calling this function here to deconstruct this object. In all those cases, I was deconstructing an object, not a tuple. If I use the function below, called getStock, that does actually return a tuple. It returns a tuple of a string, and an integer. And there are several ways to deconstruct those. You can use the var on the outside, which is my preference. You can use var internally. You can declare them explicitly. So you can deconstruct tuples exactly the same as you deconstruct an object. And if I run this code, you can see the skew is written out, the description, and the quantity 5. If I put a breakpoint here and actually run the code, you can see all the variables on the right-hand side. They've all got the same value. All got the same skew, description, and quantity in stock. So it's up to you how you like to look at deconstructing your tuple. I personally prefer the first type, which is using the var outside the parenthesis, and it allows the skew on any of these other types to change independently. See, for instance, if I change this to an integer and I return the number 1 here, for instance, I'll stop debugging. You can see the ones declared with a var, they're fine still. That's fine. However, this one's not because it's explicitly declared as a string. So let me put the code back, and that's it. That's how to deconstruct tuples. However, what happens if you have a large tuple and you don't want to deconstruct all the variables when you only need one or two of the items? Well, that's the topic of our next video, and that's where discards come into play. As you saw, there were 4 ways to deconstruct a tuple. Explicitly declare the type of each field, use the var keyword so that C# infers the type of each variable, use the var keyword individually with any or all of the variable declarations inside of the parenthesis, and finally, deconstruct the tuple into variables that have already been declared. On an object, you must declare a public void deconstruct function without parameters, and please remember that the function must be called deconstruct.